A grey September sky hung low over the Thames on the morning of September 7th, 1978, the kind of overcast London day that offers nothing remarkable, nothing to remember. It was a Thursday. Buses ran. Commuters moved across Waterloo Bridge in both directions, collars up against the damp. The river moved below with the indifference it has always shown to the affairs of the people on its banks. Georgi Markov followed his usual commuting routine that day, parking his car on London's South Bank, then walking to the bus stop on Waterloo Bridge, where he would take a short ride to his BBC office at Bush House in the Aldwych. He was 49 years old. He had dark hair, a broad face, and the particular bearing of a man who had once moved through the highest circles of a society that no longer acknowledged his existence. He was dressed for an ordinary workday. He carried no briefcase. He had no reason to appear anything other than unremarkable. He was, to every outward appearance, simply another commuter in a queue on a grey London afternoon, waiting for a bus. What happened next lasted no more than a few seconds and was witnessed by no one who understood what they were seeing. While waiting at the bus stop near Waterloo Bridge, alongside several other commuters, Markov felt a sudden sharp pain on the back of his right thigh, which he later described as similar to an insect bite. A nearby man, described as heavy-set, with a foreign accent, briefly stooped to pick up an umbrella from the ground and mumbled an apology, before hurriedly crossing the street and climbing into a waiting taxi. The cab pulled away. Within moments, it had disappeared into the traffic. Markov looked down at his leg. He saw nothing unusual. He continued to wait for his bus. If you are drawn to the documented history behind Cold War intelligence operations, the real cases, the real people, the real consequences, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we go deep on the cases that shaped the modern world. Now, back to September 7th, 1978, and the story of a man who was killed for telling the truth. To understand what happened on Waterloo Bridge that afternoon, and to understand what it meant, why it happened, and what it ultimately cost, it is necessary to go back much further, to a very different world, and to a man who had been, in another life, one of the most admired writers in a country that no longer claimed him. Georgi Markov was born on March 1st, 1929, in Kniazevo, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Sofia, the Bulgarian capital. His early years unfolded against the backdrop of a Bulgaria transforming rapidly and brutally into a Soviet-style communist state under the leadership of Todor Zhivkov, who would remain in power for 35 years. The transformation touched every aspect of Bulgarian life, what could be published, what could be said, what could be thought, and who could thrive and who would be made to disappear. Markov initially worked as a chemical engineer and teacher before tuberculosis, contracted at the age of 19, forced a long period of hospitalization. It was during that enforced stillness that he began to write seriously. The voice, he found, was precise, sardonic, and alive to the ironies of the world he inhabited. He was talented enough that the communist cultural establishment could not simply ignore him, and clear-eyed enough that he pressed against every boundary they assigned him. His 1957 novel, The Night of Cesium, was followed by The Ajax Winners in 1959 and two collections of short stories in 1961. In 1962, Markov published the novel Men, which won the annual award of the Union of Bulgarian Writers and secured his admission to that organization, membership in which was effectively a prerequisite for a professional literary career in communist Bulgaria. He wrote plays, several of which were suppressed by censors before they could be staged. He contributed to popular television series. He moved in the highest circles of Sofia's cultural life and, in doing so, acquired something that would later make him uniquely threatening to the regime: intimate, first-hand knowledge of how power actually worked in Bulgaria and of the specific people who held it. By the late 1960s, the accommodation between Markov and the communist authorities had collapsed entirely. He was writing things that could not be published, staging plays that were removed from theater programs by government order, and moving steadily toward an exit that, once taken, could never be reversed. In 1969, Markov traveled to Italy to visit his brother. His initial intention was to wait until his standing in Bulgaria improved, but he gradually changed his mind and decided to remain in the West, particularly after September 1971, when the Bulgarian government refused to renew his passport. That refusal was, in the bureaucratic vocabulary of communist states, a sentence. It meant that whatever Markov chose to do abroad, he would do it without his country's protection, and with the certainty that the state he had left behind regarded him as a criminal. In 1972, Markov's membership in the Union of Bulgarian Writers was formally suspended, and he was sentenced in absentia to 6 years and 6 months in prison for defection. His works were withdrawn from libraries and bookshops throughout Bulgaria, and his name disappeared from official Bulgarian media entirely. He was, in the eyes of the Sofia regime, erased. But erasure is difficult when the erased person has a microphone. Markov moved to London, learned English, and began working for the Bulgarian section of the BBC World Service in 1972. He later also worked for Deutsche Welle and Radio Free Europe. The Bulgarian Secret Service, the Državna Sigurnost, known within the intelligence community as the DS, opened a file on him. The code name they assigned was Wanderer. In 1975, Markov married Annabel Dilke, a colleague at the BBC World Service. The couple had a daughter, Alexandra Reina, born a year later. The family lived in South London, a quiet domestic life that ran in strange parallel to the invisible machinery being assembled far away for the purpose of ending Markov's life. The broadcasts Markov produced for Radio Free Europe, collected under the title In Absentia Reports About Bulgaria, ran weekly from November 1975 and comprised 137 individual installments. Eloquent and engaging, written in the best tradition of narrative journalism, the essays offered an eclectic mix of personal memoir and overheard stories, vivid human portraits, and philosophical speculation. Markov openly acknowledged his once privileged role within the system and exposed the secret lives of high officials and party functionaries. They were not political speeches or abstract appeals for resistance. They were the precise eyewitness testimony of a man who had sat in the rooms where Bulgaria's decisions were made, who had met Todor Zhivkov personally on multiple occasions, and who now proposed to describe, in detail and with names attached, exactly what he had seen. Annabel Markov later described her husband's broadcasts in the period before his death as having become vitriolic, not as a criticism, but as an accurate characterization of a man who had stopped pulling his punches. What she had recognized, and what Markov himself understood, was that the work had crossed a threshold. It was no longer critical of the regime in the abstract. It named names. It was specific, and it was being heard. The series ran until June 1978, 3 months before the attack on Waterloo Bridge. Markov had already completed the broadcasts that most directly provoked the assassination decision. The series was finished. The damage, from the regime's perspective, had already been done, and they killed him anyway. A declassified letter sent from the DS to the KGB in 1975 complained that Markov's radio broadcasts insolently mocked the Communist Party and encouraged dissidents in Bulgaria. A Bulgarian investigator later established that in June 1977, Zhivkov told a party Politburo meeting that he wanted Markov silenced. The task was assigned to Interior Minister Dimitar Stoyanov, who requested KGB assistance, reportedly to avoid any direct ties back to Bulgaria. KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov agreed to help, on the condition that there would be no trace back to the Soviets. The decision to kill Markov had been formally made at the highest levels of two governments. What remained was the question of how to do it in London, in public, without leaving evidence that either government could be held accountable for. Killing someone in a Western capital in 1978 was not a simple operational matter. A conventional assassination would produce an immediate investigation, diplomatic fallout, and the kind of international attention both regimes were determined to avoid. What was needed was a method that would kill without appearing to kill, one that would present itself to any investigating physician as something other than murder, and that would leave no recoverable trace of its mechanism. The KGB possessed, within a highly classified facility known internally as Laboratory Number 12, referred to informally as the Chamber, the technical capacity to manufacture exactly the kind of weapon the operation required. According to the later account of Oleg Kalugin, a senior KGB officer who subsequently defected to the West, the weapon was developed by the KGB using a stock of umbrellas purchased in Washington by their man at the Soviet embassy. If the weapon were lost or discovered during the operation, it would carry American rather than Soviet or Bulgarian provenance. The weapon was a modified umbrella, its handle containing a compressed gas mechanism of remarkable miniaturization, designed to fire a near-invisible pellet through the ferrule and into the body of a target at close range. The mechanism was nearly silent. The pellet was undetectable by the naked eye. The pellet was 1.52 millimeters wide, the size of a pinhead, constructed from an alloy of platinum and iridium. This alloy was specifically chosen because it would not trigger an immune-rejection response inside the human body. The pellet had two tiny holes bored into it at right angles, forming an X-shaped cavity that could only have been created using a laser. Inside these holes sat approximately 1/5 of a milligram of poison sealed by a wax coating designed to melt at human body temperature, releasing the poison into surrounding tissue and then the bloodstream. The poison held within that microscopic cavity was ricin, derived from the seeds of the castor bean plant. Ricin works by penetrating cells and attacking their ability to produce proteins, killing the cell from within. Once the poison reaches the bloodstream, its effects spread throughout the body. Unlike neurotoxins that kill within minutes, ricin is characterized by a slow onset of illness and a slow death. There is no antidote. There has never been an antidote. In 1978, most Western physicians had never encountered ricin poisoning in a clinical setting and would not have known to test for it. The victim would feel, at the moment of injection, nothing more than a small sharp pain, easily dismissed as an insect sting, a minor mishap, nothing requiring immediate attention. By the time the full effects became apparent, the victim would be far from the scene, and the weapon itself would be gone. It is necessary to note here what the forensic and investigative record cannot fully resolve. While the case entered public imagination as the umbrella assassination, the actual firing device has never been definitively confirmed. Annabel Markov, speaking on the BBC's Panorama program in April 1979, recalled her husband's own impression of the attack, that the jab had not been inflicted by the umbrella itself, but that the man had dropped the umbrella as cover to hide his face. This account, from the victim's wife, relaying his direct description before his death, is the closest thing the case has to a primary eyewitness account of the actual weapon used. A subsequent Bulgarian government review, working from the surviving DS files, similarly concluded that the pellet had been fired by a specially adapted pen rather than the umbrella itself, with the umbrella dropped nearby as a deliberate distraction. Since the actual firing device left the scene in the taxi and was never recovered, neither version can be definitively confirmed. What is confirmed is the pellet, the poison, the means of delivery, and the hand behind it. The operation required an agent capable of deploying this weapon in London without attracting attention. The man the DS selected had been in their service for nearly a decade, operating under a code name that would eventually become one of the most discussed in the intelligence literature of the Cold War: Agent Piccadilly. Francesco Gullino was born on May 31, 1945, in Bra, a small town in the Piedmont region of northern Italy. By his early 20s, he had acquired Danish citizenship and was living in Copenhagen, where he operated as a dealer in antiques and second-hand goods, a business that investigators would later conclude involved as much fencing as legitimate commerce. He was not an ideological recruit. He held no particular political conviction that would have made him useful to a communist intelligence service. He was a man who had been caught. Gullino's career as a DS agent began in 1970, when he was arrested in Bulgaria for smuggling contraband, drugs, and foreign currency. He was recruited under the code name Piccadilly. It was the standard mechanism by which the DS filled its overseas roles. Find a foreign national who has committed a crime on Bulgarian soil, explain the alternative to cooperation, and wait. Gullino chose service over prison, and from that single compelled choice, everything that followed became possible. What made him operationally valuable to the DS was not conviction, but logistics. His Danish passport granted him freedom of movement through Western Europe, access to Britain and France that a Bulgarian or Soviet national could not have enjoyed without considerable scrutiny. He traveled Europe in an Austrian-registered caravan, buying and selling antiques across the continent. A man crossing Western European borders with a vehicle full of old furniture attracted little notice from customs officials. He was unremarkable by design, and unremarkability was the professional quality the DS valued most in him. For several years after his initial recruitment, Gullino performed routine intelligence tasks: surveillance, information gathering, the kind of work that generates paperwork rather than headlines. Then, in late 1976, the nature of his assignments changed entirely. Gullino was ordered to travel to London in late 1976 and throughout 1977, specifically to follow Georgi Markov and study his movements and daily patterns. He was conducting the pre-operational surveillance that any serious assassination attempt requires, learning the target's routines, identifying the locations and moments where an approach would be possible, understanding the rhythm of another man's ordinary day well enough to predict when he would be vulnerable. In October 1977, Vasil Kotsev, the head of Bulgarian Foreign Intelligence, personally authorized a special training program for Agent Piccadilly. Gullino traveled to Bulgaria for firearms training, surveillance methods, and instruction in how to pass a polygraph examination. The specific inclusion of polygraph training was revealing. The DS was preparing its agent not merely for the operation itself, but for the interrogation that might follow if he were ever detained and formally questioned by a Western security service. He was being trained to lie convincingly under the conditions most likely to expose a lie. After completing his training on January 3, 1978, Gullino was honored with a formal dinner hosted by Kotsev, Vladimir Todorov, and General Stoyan Savov, senior figures in the Bulgarian intelligence apparatus. A dinner of this kind, given by men of this seniority, was not routine ceremony. It marked Piccadilly as something exceptional, an agent being prepared for a mission that had been sanctioned at the very highest levels of two governments, and that those governments regarded as consequential enough to deserve acknowledgment. Before Markov, however, the weapon was tested on a living human being. Approximately 10 days before the events on Waterloo Bridge, Vladimir Kostov, a Bulgarian journalist who had defected to the West and was living in Paris, was approached by an unknown man at a station on the Paris metro and felt a sharp jab to the back of his leg. He developed a high fever and was hospitalized. After Markov's death, scientists and members of the British anti-terror squad learned of the Kostov incident and recovered a second identical pellet from Kostov's wound. Crucially, the wax coating on Kostov's pellet had not fully dissolved, leaving intact traces that allowed investigators to deduce the sealing mechanism and confirm the substance used. Without the Kostov pellet and its preserved wax coating, Porton Down might never have been able to confirm Ricin as the cause of Markov's death. The two attacks, separated by 10 days and two capital cities, ultimately solved each other. Kostov survived. The seal on his pellet had been compromised during firing, limiting the dose of ricin that entered his bloodstream to a non-lethal amount. The weapon had functioned, the delivery system had worked. What had failed was the seal, not the mechanism. On September 7th, 1978, Zhivkov's 67th birthday, the mechanism was deployed in final form. That day, Markov worked an early shift at the BBC, went home to rest and have lunch, then drove back to South London to return for an afternoon shift. He parked his car on the south side of Waterloo Bridge and walked up to the bus stop to take a bus across to Bush House in the Aldwych. The man with the umbrella was waiting. Gullino left Britain the following morning, September 8, 1978, and traveled to Rome, where he reportedly signaled the completion of the mission to his Bulgarian handler by standing at a designated location in St. Peter's Square. Then he dissolved back into Europe, the caravan, the antiques, the border crossings, the unremarkable life of a man who buys and sells other people's discarded objects, and disappeared. When Markov arrived at Bush House in the Aldwych, he noticed a small red pimple had formed at the site of the pain on his right thigh. He told at least one colleague, Theo Lirkov, about the incident at the bus stop. He described the brief encounter, the man stooping for the umbrella, the apology in a foreign accent, the taxi, and then continued with his shift. He did not immediately seek medical attention. The pain was real, but not overwhelming. The red mark was small. He had no reason yet to understand what had been done to him. In the hours following his return home, Markov's condition worsened significantly, and he was admitted to St. James's Hospital in Balham, South London. He told the physicians what had happened on the bridge. He told them he believed he had been poisoned by the Bulgarian secret police. He said he was certain of it. Dr. Bernard Riley, working at St. James's Hospital, later recalled being told during handover about a man in one of the cubicles who claimed he had been shot by the KGB. Riley examined Markov, found a lesion on his right thigh with localized swelling, consistent with a sting or injection, suspected a toxin, and contacted Scotland Yard's Special Branch. But the physicians treating Markov had no practical framework within which to understand what was actually happening. Standard toxicological tests in a London emergency room in 1978 were not designed to detect ricin. They produced nothing conclusive. Dr. Riley considered multiple possible causes for Markov's illness, including the possibility that he had been bitten by a venomous tropical snake. He had the inflamed area of Markov's right thigh X-rayed, but no foreign object was detected at that stage. The pellet was too small, too precisely engineered, and too biologically inert to be visible on a standard X-ray. Markov's condition deteriorated over the following days with a speed that alarmed everyone monitoring him. His white blood cell count rose to levels far beyond any normal range. His organs began to fail in sequence. On September 9th, 2 days after the attack, he suffered cardiovascular collapse. The doctors worked to stabilize him. They could not. Dr. Riley was present when Markov died. His heart gave out, and there was nothing to be done. On September 11th, 1978, Georgi Markov died at St. James's Hospital at the age of 49. He had spent his final 4 days describing clearly and precisely what had been done to him and by whom, fully aware that his account would be difficult for the physicians around him to accept, and fully aware that it was true. He had been right about everything. He had been right too late. The autopsy was performed at the Wandsworth Public Mortuary on September 12, 1978. It revealed that Markov's lungs were full of fluid from heart failure, his liver was damaged from blood poisoning, and his intestines, lymph nodes, and heart were riddled with small hemorrhages. His white blood cell count had reached levels far beyond any normal range. Standard toxicological testing produced nothing conclusive. The pathologists knew the findings were consistent with severe poisoning, but could not identify the agent responsible through conventional means. The pellet was discovered when a pathologist cut a section of tissue from the wound area on Markov's right thigh and began examining the sample. A small, loose piece of metal shifted within the tissue, nearly rolling off the examination table entirely. It was carefully collected and transferred to the Chemical Defense Establishment at Porton Down in Wiltshire for analysis. What the scientists found there confirmed that this was not a natural death, not a medical failure, and not anything that could be explained by misfortune. The pellet was 1.52 millimeters wide, constructed from an alloy of platinum and iridium with 2 tiny holes bored at right angles to each other, forming an X-shaped cavity. The holes could only have been created using a laser. The materials, the precision, the engineering, none of it was consistent with any accidental or natural cause of death. This bore the signature of a state-level technical operation conducted by people with access to tools and expertise that no private actor possessed. Confirming the specific poison required both careful deduction and a grim experiment. The technicians at Porton Down found no trace of ricin remaining in the pellet or in the surrounding tissue. The poison had already dispersed entirely through Markov's system. Working backward through the evidence and drawing on the intact wax coating recovered from Kostov's identical pellet in Paris, investigators identified ricin as the substance the cavity had been designed to hold. To confirm the diagnosis, scientists administered the same quantity to a pig of approximately Markov's weight. The animal died within 24 hours, and its autopsy revealed the same internal damage, the same hemorrhaging, the same organ failure, the same pattern of destruction, found in Markov. 4 months after Markov's death, in January 1979, a coroner's inquest in London formally ruled that he had been murdered with ricin, contained in a pellet implanted in his right thigh through a specially modified device. The murder weapon itself was never recovered. The man behind Markov on the bridge had carried it away in the taxi. It has never been found. Scotland Yard's investigation moved steadily and consistently into walls. The Bulgarian government, still under Zhivkov, declined to cooperate with British investigators. The Soviet government was not a party to any form of bilateral information exchange with British law enforcement. The witnesses at the bus stop had not understood they were watching a murder, and most had long since forgotten the unremarkable afternoon when a man apologized to a stranger and stepped into a cab. What Scotland Yard possessed was a method, a victim, a pellet, and certainty about the involvement of a foreign intelligence service. What they lacked was a name. That name would come not through Scotland Yard's investigative machinery, but through the work of a Bulgarian journalist who refused, long after it became politically convenient, to stop asking questions. In November 1989, as communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed with a speed that astonished even their most optimistic opponents, Bulgaria underwent its own transformation. Zhivkov, who had ruled Bulgaria for 35 years, was ousted from power. The DS was formally dissolved. In the chaos and urgency of the transition, enormous quantities of documentation were destroyed. In June 1992, General Vladimir Todorov, the former Bulgarian intelligence chief, was sentenced to 16 months in prison for destroying 10 volumes of material on the Markov case. General Stoyan Savov, the deputy interior minister, committed suicide rather than face trial for destroying the files. Vasil Kotsev, widely believed to have been the operational commander of the assassination plot, died in an unexplained car accident. The destruction of those documents was itself a form of confession. Men do not go to prison and die by their own hand to protect records that contain nothing incriminating. But not everything was destroyed. Among the few D's files to survive the incineration was one containing false passports issued in a single name, a signed agreement to work under a code name, and receipts for thousands of pounds in cash dating to the period immediately around September 1978. The file belonged to an agent codenamed Piccadilly. Bulgarian journalist Hristo Hristov, after a 3-year legal battle with the Bulgarian government, obtained access to the surviving archives of the former service, including what remained of the files on both Georgi Markov and the man Hristov identified as the most probable perpetrator, Francesco Gullino. Hristov's research confirmed that working as Agent Piccadilly, Gullino had flown to London 3 times in 1977 and 1978. The Bulgarian files confirmed he was the only DS agent in London at the time of Markov's murder. In February 1993, Danish authorities, acting on information from Bulgarian sources following the political transition, located Gullino in Copenhagen and detained him for questioning. British detectives from Scotland Yard were present throughout. Gullino admitted to having worked as a Bulgarian intelligence agent but denied any involvement in the killing. He was released because Denmark had no viable charges against him. He returned to his life of moving through Europe with his antiques. He was a suspect, but not a prisoner. He was known, but not charged. He continued to travel freely throughout the continent while Scotland Yard's file on the murder remained formally open. The weight of circumstantial evidence against Gullino was, in the assessment of every serious investigator who reviewed it, severe. He had been sent to London specifically to surveil Markov. He had undergone a training program personally authorized by the head of Bulgarian foreign intelligence. He had been honored by a formal dinner with senior DS figures before the operation. He was the only DS agent in London on September 7, 1978. He had left the country the morning after the attack. After departing London, he was issued a false passport by the Bulgarian residency in Vienna, the kind of document provided to agents who need to disappear from the record entirely. What did not exist, because it had been burned, was a document stating explicitly that Francesco Gullino killed Georgi Markov. In 2013, a German filmmaker tracked Gullino to the small Austrian city of Wels, where he was living as an art dealer. When asked directly whether he had killed Georgi Markov, Gullino replied, "If I were the murderer, do you think I should just say it?" He then offered, unprompted, a brief reflection on the Cold War itself, that both sides had accused each other of terrible things, that the entire period had been defined by mutual accusation. It was, coming from him at that moment, either a genuine observation or a precision evasion. The two were, by that point in his life, impossible to distinguish. Francesco Gullino died in Austria in August 2021. He was 76 years old. He went to his grave neither confirming nor denying what he had done on a grey afternoon on a London bridge 43 years before. He was never charged with anything related to the death of Georgi Markov. The aftermath of the murder spread outward in ways the men who ordered it could not have entirely anticipated. In London, Annabel Markov and their 2-year-old daughter, Alexandra Reina, were left to absorb a loss that was simultaneously private and entirely public. The death of Georgi Markov was immediately a matter of international news and diplomatic tension, and his widow was required to grieve in full view of a press that treated the case as a political event rather than a personal catastrophe. She gave interviews. She appeared on the BBC's Panorama program. She built what stability she could for herself and her daughter in the years that followed. Alexandra Reina Markov was 2 years old when her father died. She grew up in Britain, in a country that remembered him as a Cold War symbol, a name attached to a famous case and a famous weapon. She grew up knowing that her father's murder had a literature, a documentary tradition, a permanent exhibit in a Washington museum. What she grew up without was a father. Not the symbol, but the man who had parked a car on the south bank of the Thames, walked to a bus stop, and waited for a bus that would take him to work. The distinction between those two things is one that only she can measure, and she has kept it entirely to herself. Back in Bulgaria, the KGB defectors, who would eventually speak about the operation, did so carefully and in stages. Oleg Kalugin confirmed publicly that the KGB had been involved in the assassination, noting that the Soviets had even presented the Bulgarian assassin with alternatives, including a poisonous jelly to be smeared on Markov's skin, before settling on the Ricin pellet. Oleg Gordievsky, another KGB defector, also confirmed Soviet complicity. Their combined testimony established what the forensic evidence had already strongly implied. This was not a Bulgarian operation merely assisted by the KGB. It was a joint operation, with the KGB providing both the technical means and the authorization that killing a man in a Western capital required. Scotland Yard repeatedly requested access to Bulgarian government archives in the years that followed, and Bulgaria's democratic governments proved almost as uncooperative as their communist predecessors. In May 2008, 30 years after the murder, Scotland Yard formally reopened the case and sent investigators to Bulgaria once more to request documents and question former security figures. The reopening produced headlines and no arrests. The chain of accountability had been severed methodically at every link. Kotsev in his car accident, Savov by his own hand, Todorov after his brief prison sentence. By the time the democratic governments of Bulgaria were in a position to cooperate fully, the men who could have answered the most important questions were gone. Scotland Yard's file on the murder of Georgi Markov remains officially open. Markov's standing in Bulgaria underwent a profound transformation in the decades following his death. During Zhivkov's rule, he had been an official non-person, erased from libraries, stripped of membership, his name forbidden from appearing in print. After the regime's fall, his in absentia reports were published in Bulgaria in 1990, the first opportunity Bulgarian readers had ever had to encounter what their most celebrated exile had been saying about them and their country for the previous decade. In 2000, Bulgaria posthumously awarded Markov the Order of Stara Planina, the country's most prestigious national honor, for his significant contribution to Bulgarian literature and drama, and for his exceptional civic courage in confronting the communist regime. The same state apparatus that had sentenced him to prison in absentia and organized his murder was, a generation later, presenting him with its highest decoration. The contradiction is not subtle. It is, perhaps, the clearest possible illustration of what regimes will do to suppress the truth and what the truth will do once the regime is gone. The question of what the murder of Georgi Markov ultimately accomplished, from the perspective of those who ordered it, admits of no satisfying answer. In the narrow operational sense, the mission succeeded. His voice was silenced. The weekly broadcasts that had described in intimate and precise detail the corruptions of Zhivkov's Bulgaria ended on September 11, 1978. No one else with Markov's specific knowledge, his specific voice, and his specific willingness to use both was available to replace him. But the murder itself became, and has remained, one of the most consequential pieces of evidence ever assembled against the moral character of Soviet-style governance. The details of how Georgi Markov was killed, the pellet engineered in a secret laboratory, the ricin sealed behind wax that melted at body temperature, the weapon deployed on a crowded bridge in broad daylight, the clean disappearance into London traffic, entered the global imagination in a way that no official denial could contain. The case became a permanent entry in the Cold War's moral accounting, specific, documented, incontrovertible proof of a system willing to invest extraordinary technical sophistication and years of careful preparation in the project of silencing a single man with a microphone. A replica of the umbrella, believed to have been used to assassinate Markov, is on permanent display at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. The original was never recovered, but the replica, an ordinary umbrella, indistinguishable from any other, sits in its case as a monument to what ordinary objects can be made to do when a state decides a man must die. There is also Gullino to consider, not as a mechanism, but as a person. He was not an ideologue. He was a man who had been caught smuggling on a Bulgarian border in 1970 and given a choice that was not really a choice. He served a service not because he believed in what it stood for, but because the alternative was a Bulgarian prison cell with an uncertain future. Whatever he was asked to do over the following years, he did. He trained, he traveled, he surveilled, and on an afternoon on a London bridge, he did the thing he had been sent to do, and spent the remaining 43 years of his life moving through European cities, buying and selling antiques, answering no one's questions, confirming nothing, denying nothing, existing in the gray space between evidence and proof. That is the only place a man in his position could safely inhabit. Whether guilt visited him in those decades is not recorded anywhere. Whether he thought, in the long years after the Cold War ended and the system that had made him dissolved, about the man on the bridge, about the apology, the taxi, the afternoon, is not recorded. He left no memoir. He gave no confession. He offered the world only the observation that if he were the murderer, he would not say so. Georgi Markov was 49 years old when he parked his car on the south bank of the Thames, walked to a bus stop, and felt a sting he immediately recognized as something significant. He was 49 years old when he died 4 days later, having spent those 4 days being entirely correct about what had been done to him and entirely unable to do anything about it. He left behind a wife, a 2-year-old daughter, and a body of work that his country had spent years suppressing and would eventually honor with its highest award. The broadcasts still exist. His voice is still audible in archived recordings. The weapon that killed him was never found, his killer was never charged. On his gravestone in the churchyard at Whitchurch, Dorset, there is a single line: Georgi Markov died for the cause of freedom. 7 words, chosen by a widow, carved into stone in a quiet English churchyard, far from the Sophia where he was born and far from the bridge where he was killed. They are the most precise summary of his life that exists, and they are the last word on everything the Cold War was willing to do to make sure that a man like him could not be heard.